Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Redlines, a show where we dive into some daring conversations and cross some boundaries of probably your political speak. Today, we're talking about, well, how the world has fully stalled and stopped thinking of anything geopolitical that's going on around it because, well, we're all waiting in the American election and the outcome of that. Today with me, I have Kaylin Robertson and Paul Stelmach, and we're going to be discussing just that. Paul?
So, greetings everyone. My name is Paul Stelmach. Currently, I am like editor-in-chief of UETV English, and I've been working as a Ukrainian journalist for a long, long time. Uh, Now we are working at the international broadcasting, and today in the studio with Red Lines discussing some hot topics. I believe hot topics with you guys.
Kaylin?
So I am a journalist that has moved here full time. I lived in Odessa for the last 2 months. I just finished a film in Kherson, and now I moved to Kiev as of 2 hours ago.
Oh, well, welcome to Kyiv. I think I'm also going to add that Kaylin is a very viral journalist. And if you are anywhere on X or Twitter, then you probably have seen him because recently he's done a lot of very scandalous interviews with very scandalous people and sort of probably showed them their place. So Kaylin is a very good interviewer outside of also being a documentary journalist. So, I think today it's very difficult to sort of speak about what's happening with Ukraine right now because I feel like there is such a veil of uncertainty based on what's going to come out of the American election because that likely will dictate the course of the war for the next years to come. I'm curious. So, since you've lived most of your life in the UK, right? What do you think the UK is going to do if the US, if Trump, for instance, wins and, well, cuts off aid to Ukraine? What do you think is going to be the UK's stance in that?
Well, I think the UK is going to continue to act too little too late and be too weak on their policies with Ukraine. Boris Johnson, during the beginning of this war, was pretty good, actually. He promised and armed this country in a way that it needed to be armed, and things slowly deteriorated and diminished after that moment. And the UK since then has tried to play this sort of flaccid policy of trying to placate Russia. You know, they're scared of Putin. They've been basically too weak on the Russian threat that exists to people in Britain. I mean, as a person that grew up in Britain, I understand now the Russian threat to the country that I live in and how terrifying it is. But I don't think politicians in our country realize how terrifying it is. And I think that that will continue because there's no sign that it's going to change. I mean, David Lammy said recently in a speech that, you know, Putin is a tyrant and, you know, that's terrible and Crimea is Ukraine. Those are words that's great. But Ukraine doesn't need words right now. Ukraine needs the weapons and the permission to use the weapons that it needs to fire into the places in Russia that are killing, that are launching missiles and killing civilians. And that's not been happening. And I don't think a Trump presidency will change any of the UK policies. Actually, the UK is at the behest of America, and it always really has been since the fall of the British Empire, which has been happening since World War II, where America follows, Britain leads. Where America leads, Britain follows. And that's been a policy of foreign policy for a long time. You know, even during the Iraq War, Britain followed America's lead. And if America shouts, Britain will follow. And if America says that they're not going to support Ukraine, I actually think that Britain might actually have a similar approach because nothing really has changed since those days. We're far too cautious. And I think it's extremely worrying. I think that a Trump presidency is make or break for the future of Ukraine. I hope it isn't because the technology advancements that are happening here are incredible, and the ingenuity and the way that Ukrainians have basically figured out how to use, you know, how to make ballistic missiles and drones themselves is absolutely incredible. And I think that's because that in this country they have a hunch that they're not going to have the support from the West for much longer because the West has become pathetic. And they've realized that they have to fight this war themselves, and they're doing it really well. They're blowing the world away. So I'm very pessimistic about it. If Trump wins, I think Britain will loosely follow in the type of policies that Trump puts in. If Harris wins, we're going to see 4 more years of Biden, because Biden hasn't actually been that sentient for the last 4 years. And Harris and her team have basically ran a lot of American foreign policy, and we'll just see a continuation of that, which is more caution. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Ukraine is on its own. Ukraine realizes that. That's why they're accelerating and advancing in such incredible ways in technology themselves. But I've lost faith in my country because we're doing too little too late. And we haven't done anything necessary in the last year or so to allow this country to win a war that's essentially with us. You know, this isn't a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between Russia and the West. And if you live in the West and if you live in Britain, then Russia is also at war with you. They shot down planes over our continent. They poisoned people with chemical weapons over our soil. They poisoned our democracy with propaganda and allowed things like Brexit to destabilize our economies. They've been at war with us for a long time. We just don't realize it. And I feel let down by our leaders. And I think I will continue to be let down by our leaders into the future.
So I agree with a lot of what you said. I will disagree a little bit on Harris, because she is completely taking a new team with her. And I'm actually a little bit hopeful as someone who's like, you know, who's equally as American as I am Ukrainian in certain ways. I am a little more hopeful in her presidency than I am in Biden's, because Biden's team is the same as was during the times of Obama. And we all know that that was an international politics disaster. His presidency has left a lot of very bad things behind in terms of international politics and America's role in it. So Biden had that entire team. Kamala is bringing on a whole new team, and one of her defense advisors that I like to defer to a lot is Philip Gordon, who would be the chief of the Defense Advisement Office in America, according to multiple rumors and sources on the Hill. He's also the same guy who wrote a manifesto in 2018 asking America to start a Cold War with Russia, based on the threat that Russia poses to the world and to the United States. So on that regard, if Harris wins, I think she's also a little younger. I think her approach is a little different. I was on the Hill during the Ukraine Action Summit a couple of weeks ago, and I actually used to think the same way as you did until I met with a bunch of senators and a bunch of congressmen. And I've realized, and I've met mostly with Republicans, which is interesting because those are the people that largely don't support Ukraine enough. And interestingly, the idea on the Hill is that the only roadblock to Ukraine aid is, well, Trump, obviously, but if we talk about today, not in the future, is Biden, because he's kind of old. He's scared of taking risks. He's that like old school politician who you know took office in 1978 or 1975, which is crazy. Like, you know, so my parents weren't born in 1975, I think, and he was already in the office, which is insane. So there is that, but I do agree I wonder. Well, I do agree on everything else you said. What I do wonder is, do you think the new government with Keir Starmer is better, or does that change anything?
I think it changes nothing. The overall attitude from the British government, whether it's Labour or Conservative, has been pretty indifferent to Ukraine in the last year or so because, well, there's two reasons. One, we don't understand the Russian threat that exists and how serious it is. And two, there's a massive propaganda campaign that exists from the Kremlin that has poisoned our airwaves. That basically means that the voters of both parties in our countries complain whenever we donate anything to this country because they say, this is our tax dollars, this is our money, this is wasted, this is a pointless war. And the government in our countries want to be re-elected. They're re-elected every 4 years and they want to appease voters. And unfortunately, the voters of Britain have been compromised by Kremlin propaganda, who think that their money, which by the way is 0.2% of British GDP, compared to 41% of the public spending in Russia, on this war, which is nothing. It is totally insignificant. So they're terrified of their own voter base because Kremlin propaganda has convinced them that this war is pointless to support, and they don't understand the Russian threat. This exists across all Western government, and it is the reason that this country hasn't won this war yet. So I'm deeply pessimistic about it, and I don't see what's going to change unless we shut down Russian propaganda and we involve the CIA, the FBI, the full might of our intelligence services to find out exactly how the bot farms are running, exactly who is paid, and who are versions of the Tenet media scandal that we saw, of which there are many, and start arresting people for propaganda, then this isn't going to be dealt with. This is going to continue endlessly. And so I'm really pessimistic about it. And again, I feel ashamed as a British person / Irish person to be in this country, to be under fire like I was in Kherson, to be personally even targeted by drones, to realize that they're happy to kill British people just as much as they're happy to kill Ukrainian people. And British people should know that, but they don't understand the threat and they're too scared to support winning this war.
Well,
So, you know,
they're likely a lot more inclined to kill British people, right? I'm going to sort of jump in here for a second. For anyone who hasn't seen Kalen's documentary on Kherson, you should go on his channel and you should watch it. Because didn't you discover through your intelligence connections that the reason why the drones were following you so ardently, I suppose, is because you had your British SIM card in, and that was a foreign journalist, so that was a great target for them to have.
Yeah, so I mean, I was told when I was there, which is why, I mean, I was very confused when I arrived there because I was chased by a drone within like hours of arriving, which is a pretty strange situation. But my intelligence source in the UK basically said because I had a UK SIM card, that lights up like a big blue dot, like a big red flag, because the Russians have installed 4G, 5G towers all along the Dnieper River. They've also installed 2,000 other phone network towers in the Kherson and Zaporizhia region, and they have started bombing the towers in the Ukrainian territories so that people's phones start connecting to those towers. And when your phone connects to a Russian tower, what the Russians can do is they can see everything on your phone. Every phone call, they can look at who you are, they can intercept your geolocated data, they can find out where you live and where you are. And they can also install through AI technology and drones that will target the IP addresses of certain people's phones, which is what I think happened in Kherson. But yeah, I mean, that moment made me realize, as if, you know, I already kind of knew, but it made this feel even more personal because they're actively happy to and even more excited to kill British and Americans. And that should show the West that Russia is at war with all of us more than anything, but it still hasn't. Because when the Russian army, if it ever takes this country, which I hope and I don't think it will, but if it did, it will look west again. And the Russian army is going to be much harder to defeat in the towns and cities and fields of the rest of Europe than it is right now on the front line in the Donbass. And the Ukrainians are willing to fight this war basically on the behalf of all of us in the West, and they're not doing it. And I realized that when I was in Kherson, when I could feel the Russians at the other side of the river, that this is the threat to all of us. So, yeah.
I mean, it is, and it also feeds into the idea, right, that you said that the only way that we could probably properly guarantee support for Ukraine and a proper end to this war, which is on Ukraine's terms, is if the people finally realize the threat and if the government finally realize the threat, right? I do think that the government is realizing the threat of Russia, but it's not imminent. It's not imminent on their territory right now. And when we think about the threat of Russia, especially as civilians, we think about tanks rolling through our cities. And we know that that's not going to happen, right? Or at least not anytime sooner. We're not nearly as close to a dire situation in which that could. But Russia doesn't need to roll tanks through your cities for Russia to like invade you, because we are already seeing Russian propaganda and Russian shills in the government and how easily they're manipulating the masses worldwide. Like, you know, and I say this every single time I'm on air of anything, right? It's like, look at Hungary, look at Slovakia, look at the Netherlands, like look at Marine Le Pen, look at all of these far right movements that are all resembling the Russian model, and all of them love Putin. It becomes not even about their election campaign, it becomes about them loving Russia and them advocating for Russia, right?
Exactly.
So it's one of those things where we're missing this. But I wonder why, like, what's the holdup with the MI6, with the CIA, right? With all of these intelligence services that are superior to the KGB coming together and putting an end to this. I wonder if it's because they don't feel like the threat is imminent, or whether they just don't know how to deal with Russia. Because in a lot of cases, I feel like the West just doesn't know how to deal with Russia.
Well, the CIA and the British version of the CIA, and this counts for the rest of the West, are answering to the Conservative, the Labour, the Republican, or the Democrat governments. Those are their those are their bosses, right? And the people that are in power who ask them what to pursue and what to focus on will be the focus of their investigations. And right now, again, the people who are in charge of our countries, of America and Britain, don't take the threat serious enough and are not allocating the resources and telling the CIA, telling the FBI, and telling British intelligence to focus on the threat that they actually need to focus on. And we could do it. I mean, the White House has started on a surface level, starting to realize how bad this is with the Tenet media scandal we had a couple of months ago, where we've had Margarita Simonyan, head of Russia Today, giving tens of millions of dollars to Lauren Shen, who then funneled that money to right-wing commentators, to people like Tim Pool, who has hundreds of millions of views a month, to say that Ukraine is the enemy of the West. That's the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of other organizations that exist like that. But I was looking into the investigation, and I was looking into the whole department that was analyzing all of this. And a source inside of that department basically told me that they were too scared to actively pursue it right now and to actively start arresting people because there's an election coming up and they don't want to be seen as, imprisoning journalists or going after the press just before an election. So we're terrified. We're constantly on edge and terrified. So we're telling our intelligence services to hold off, to not do anything, because we don't want it to be seen as bad optics. Because the opposition to our government, well, to the American government right now, which is Trump, is in the pocket of Putin. And essentially, he's kind of calling the shots in a lot of ways, if you look at it like that. So they're not focusing their resources where they need to be focused, which is on the real enemy, because they are at the behest of their bosses, which are the British and American government, which are either too scared or too compromised to tell them what to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think, the scary situation about everything that's going on right now and sort of like Europe's opinion on everything is that America holds not Europe's opinion on everything. I feel like I'm being so vague on this. It's like the scary part of this entire situation is that Ukraine's victory and our opportunities and what we can do depends on the election in the United States. Because no matter what, depending on what happens to the US and who is the president, we're either going to get kind of the same deal, maybe a little better, and we're still going to have to figure out a lot of stuff ourselves, but then we can kind of poke Europe to do better, right, and hope for that. Or we are completely stuck in a very atrocious situation where we have Trump and the world follows because America holds its hand on the pulse of the entirety of the Western world. And that's sad. And I think it's sort of giving me even more of a feeling of like, oh, we're stuck in a limbo to talk to you today, because I've been feeling that way since I've come back to the US. It's a little different when you're in Ukraine, right? Like you're still getting the same information. I mean, all of my, field of view is English speaking. All of my algorithms are English speaking. So all of the content that I get is political from America, but it's not necessarily, the feel is not the same. And I've been here now for 3 weeks and I'm going to be here for another week or two. And coming back here, it's almost like everything has stalled and all the politicians don't want to talk about anything until the election. Everyone basically tells you, oh, you got to survive the next 40 days. And then that's when you're going to find out what's next. And it's terrifying because every 30 days, every day, every 2 days, things get worse and Russia goes further and further. And it doesn't have to mean territorially, but progress-wise, Russia brainwashes more people. Russia buys more politicians. Russia figures out how to install more of their own connections in the governing bodies in different countries. Russia spreads propaganda narratives. It's like every day weighs as much as gold does. And not understanding that and putting that on the back burner because there is an American election and completely not caring about Ukraine for 40 days straight is really not a good strategy.
No, it isn't. But this is an unprecedented political situation. 20 years ago, and even during the Cold War, there was a unilateral agreement between Republicans and Democrats that Russia was a threat to America because there was a common sense of discourse. People knew fact and fiction, and there was a common enemy, right? And now that's different because Russia has managed to sow the seeds of division in such a way and fracture the even sense of common shared knowledge in America to the point of inciting civil war, that that situations like that can't exist anymore. Again, if this was 30 or 40 years ago, if Russia hadn't influenced our politics so much, this wouldn't be an issue around the time of the election, because Republicans and Democrats would unilaterally agree that Russia is a threat to Ukraine, Europe, and America, and it wouldn't be an issue. It wouldn't be something that they have to be quiet and cautious and scared about, because they wouldn't think, which is what Biden thinks right now, that the opposition can use any kind of escalation as an opportunity. And that's what is so difficult about this situation, because it shows just how different things are now to how they were before in the US, and how broken it is, because we can't agree on facts anymore. We can't agree on any facts. This is why a huge number of Americans, I think it's a third, believe in a COVID-related conspiracy or a QAnon-related conspiracy. And it's also why Americans can't agree on their common enemy, which are places like Russia. And that's what it is. And now we have to all be quiet, and we all have to hold our breaths before the election, because of the dysfunction that Russia has caused in our information sphere. It's despicable.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've watched Operation Infection, either one of you, but Operation Infection basically talks about how Russia specifically caused these divisive narratives, and why we got to the point where you can show someone a list of facts and they can be approved by, I don't know, 30 separate independent sources, and people will still not believe the facts. Like, you can tell them, the grass is green, and you can show them green grass, and they've been told the grass is yellow, and they're going to think that there is a conspiracy behind it, and you made the grass green. You made it seem green. And that's specifically how Russia does it. It's a KGB tactic, and it has 4 stages to it. And it was done on purpose. And the funny thing is that the timeline usually for this to start working is 30 years. How long has Putin been in power?
30 years. And actually, there's a course called Combat Propaganda that's taught, that started about 30 years ago, that someone I know actually studied and is now a defector in the FSB. And they said, Kaylin, Russia started this war a long time before the West even realized how propaganda works in the same way. And they started this way before, even before I was born. And now we're seeing the trees growing from the roots of what was planted in Russia. But it was called Combat Propaganda. That course, which is taught by the FSB, the KGB at the time, Margarita Simonyan studied in. It was it's a real life version of the film Red Sparrow, and now we're seeing the fruits of that today.
Well,
because Russia excels in propaganda, because they excel at lying, because that's the kind of mafia culture they are.
Well, generally, the interesting bit that I don't think a lot of people know is that in St. Petersburg, no matter which major you're focusing on, every single one of them has a course that basically is ideological subversion. So even if you are a good Russian, which I don't believe necessarily need to be brought to attention, because there are so few of, like, actually, not even good, but I guess so few reasonable people that are from Russia that are actually doing something valuable for society. But point is that even if you went to school in St. Petersburg, that particular university, which most Russian educated people go to, it's Moscow or St. Petersburg, right? You will have been subjected to ideological subversion courses, and you don't even know that. So you working in the West, you're already spreading Russia favorable narratives, because that's what you've been taught to do without your consent. And so a lot of these journalists end up basically spreading these very imperialistic, Russia-loving narratives, because that's what they have been taught to do in their propaganda courses in their universities that they did not know were ideological subversion propaganda courses, turning them into propaganda machines without their own consent. So I think the biggest mistake that we're making in the West is we're still employing Russians. Like, we're employing them in the Washington Post, we're employing them in the New York Times, we're employing them in the Telegraph, we're employing them in ministries. They are, they work in creative fields, they work in cultural fields, they work in media fields, and that needs to stop. Because the issue is that we're not dealing with a normal country. We're not dealing with the poor people that have been deceived. We're dealing with a machine and a conglomerate that produces propaganda of their imperial mind through their own people, even if those people don't realize it.
We're not just employing them, though. We're being bought by them. Alexander Lebedev bought the London Evening Standard a decade ago, which is one of the most read newspapers in the capital of Britain. And I had a friend who was a journalist in the offices after he bought that newspaper. He said that on a daily basis, he would be handed 10 to 12 stories about Russia. And he would look through them and go, we can let that one through. That looks like it slipped through. Nope, not filing that, not filing that, filing that. The Russians are not being employed by us. They own a huge amount of our society. They own shares in a huge amount of our companies. London is one of the money laundering capitals of the world. When Putin took Crimea, Angela Merkel took him for a champagne lunch and opened the Nord Stream pipeline. We don't just employ Russians, we allow them to dominate our society and buy our newspapers and pump out propaganda inside our own country. No other country would tolerate that. Can you imagine if America and Britain sent CIA operative types, which is the equivalent of Alexander Lebedev, to Moscow to open news outlets to pump out anti-Russian propaganda? They would be arrested for treason within seconds. Yet Britain doesn't just not arrest them, they give them knighthoods. They give them knighthoods, they allow them peerages, they reward them and put them at the heart of our society. And that's a sickness that needs to end immediately. I made a documentary with John Sweeney a couple of years ago called Compromat. And it was about how when Boris Johnson was the Home Secretary of Britain, he went to parties at the Palazzo Terranova, which was owned by the Lebedevs, and we doorstepped that palazzo. We went there to Perugia and we did all this sort of stuff. But it was about the sickness at the heart of British democracy. And it was about showing how infiltrated we've been by the Russians and how our leaders and politicians have gone to their parties and maybe there's been compromat filmed on them, but it doesn't really matter. We have elevated Russians to the top of our society. We've allowed them to own parts of our press openly. And no other country would allow this that has any sense. And I think that's what's really difficult. I know we have the issues with Russians at war. We've got these documentaries that shouldn't be allowed to air, and we shouldn't be allowing the tentacles of Kremlin, filthy money and propaganda to infiltrate our film festivals. But the bigger threat is the fact that we're rewarding these people with state knighthoods and allowing them to buy our press. I mean, that is the serious threat. And he still owns that newspaper. And his father was trained by the KGB. This is a disgrace. And it's a stain on British society that makes even me feel ashamed to be British.
I mean, the same thing happens, to be fair, in the US and in Italy. And every single time we hear about a scandal, in the Olympic Games or any sporting events or in the cultural world where Russian artists were highlighted or Russian artists were allowed to participate, it always turns out that the general of the commission is Russian, or their name sounds Russian, but they're an American citizen or an Italian citizen. But like we all know, they have a Russian citizenship, and these guys are Putin's oligarchs and Putin's puppets. So that doesn't only happen in the UK, it happens in a lot of other countries. Actually, a very, very recent example of this that a lot of people have missed is Vice News. I don't know if you're aware, either one of you, but Vice News is one of the majorly responsible newspapers for the image of Azov as Nazis. They carefully crafted that image for years and years and years in their YouTube, and then Vice went broke. Vice stopped publishing their newspapers, they stopped publishing YouTube videos, their digital media went away. So Vice is actually relaunching their platform in, I believe, next month. And they're doing 4 quarterly print issues now of like Vice art book, photo book magazine. And guess what they're relaunching with? So they're relaunching full force, like as if the money problems were never problems, right? So someone gave them money to do this. And the first issue that they're relaunching centers around a Russian photographer who lives in St. Petersburg.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a surprise because the Western media is failing. The money is leaving Western media and print newspaper, and it's going to YouTube, it's going to TikTok, it's going to other platforms. And when it's failing, they need buyers. And for some absolute bizarre reason, our government allows those buyers to be Russian. Russians should not be allowed to buy anything in the West, not property, and especially not news. They shouldn't be allowed to buy anything. They shouldn't be allowed to go to a shop and buy a can of Coke. Right. And that doesn't surprise me. That's the first I've heard of it, but this is what they've been doing for ages. That's an absolute disgrace. Hopefully more people find out about that and it gets banned. But I mean, Another tentacle of the Kremlin, I guess. Another tentacle.
Always many tentacles of the Kremlin. Paul, do you have any? I'm sorry that we have sort of been, we have been having a dialogue for the past 30 minutes, but do you have anything to add to anything that we've said?
I just keep thinking of one word as you were talking, Munich. So Munich 2.0, I believe the Germans, Nazi Germany, had an influence. They were allowed to buy newspapers. They've launched, basically, Italy and Mussolini had the first TV and radio broadcast of a politician appealing to people in the world history. So it was Mussolini. Then Goebbels spread radio, like free radio receivers, to all Germans to spread propaganda on a state level. So it is the same with this. They are buying newspapers, they are influencing the West, and then we wonder why the West is not very eager to fight Russian money. So they are funded by Russian money, and then we wonder why they are not so eager to arrest those people. What what will they live off from? That's number one.
Yeah.
And number two, we know what happened after Munich. So Mr. Chamberlain was very glad that he had appeased Hitler and Mussolini not to attack anyone, but to take a bite of Czechoslovakia. And even Poland got a bite of Czechoslovakia back then in 1939 or 1938, I believe, when the Munich did happen. And we are very close to that. We are very close to Munich, and God forbid that happening again. We are very waiting for the Rammstein 25. There were rumors that at Rammstein 25 some very significant should have happened, like announcement of Ukraine partially joining NATO, maybe without occupied territories, something like that. But we had to be presented with some kind of guarantees of safety so that Russians won't advance further. What we're having now is uncertainty, and that scares me. That scares the hell out of me because uncertainty produces fear, and people in the West are fearful, in my opinion. If we say about the British, they don't understand the horrific amount of glide bombs, missiles, and Iranian drones flying towards you every night. We had 46 days in a row, each night a Shahad bombardment of Kyiv and the whole of Ukraine. It was last night the first in 2 months that we could just sleep at night. And that is very reminiscent of the bombing of London in during World War II. So I'm scared, to be honest, but I keep the hope, and I appreciate that, and I think that no matter who wins the elections in the United States, we have a chance, and we will stand to that.
That's nice. I mean, the analogy of the Blitz is correct. I mean, when I was in Odessa for the last 2 months, the tracers that were being shot into the sky, the number of drones they were putting in, it looked like the Blitz. They had the searchlights looking into the sky because this country doesn't have the same Patriot air defense system that it does in every city here because it hasn't been given the weapons it needs to defend itself. Literally old school searchlights looking for these drones and blowing them out of the sky, and you can't sleep there. And I remember sitting and looking at this and thinking, when will it be that I'm back in London or back in, France, when I have the same view out of my window in 20, 30 years' time when Russia brings this further west and I see the same thing everywhere? That was the most terrifying thing ever. Gosh, I just don't know how Ukrainians are mentally coping with this. I don't know how they're mentally coping with it because it is constant and it feels like it's getting so much worse.
I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think one of the blessings and curses that we have in Ukraine is that we do always figure out what to do, and we do always figure out how to hold out. And I think that also kind of gives the West this idea that they don't necessarily have to bother or hurry to help us, because that's okay, they're going to hold out, like they're coming out with drones, they're coming out with missiles. Look at that, they basically took back Kharkiv with absolutely nothing, with their bare hands, and weren't getting any shipments. So why would we hurry and worry if they can hold their own? But the problem is that we're not holding our own because we can. We're holding our own because if we don't, we're gonna collapse. Like the front line today, which is not spoken about in the world at all, is at the point of crumbling. It's
Yeah.
really difficult. There is so much Russia is doing. The front line is moving further and further west every day. And maybe, yes, sure, it's a couple of meters, but there are places that are so incredibly overwhelmed, and there are not enough brigades. There are not enough people defending them, not because, I don't know, there are not enough people, but it's because they're all exhausted and they haven't been, they haven't been changed. People are getting tired of the war. The narratives in Ukraine, also Russian propaganda in Ukraine, is working. There are so many people being upset at the government for mobilizing people.
Yeah.
And we're in the state of a full-scale invasion. I understand that you don't want to go fight. No one does, but what's the alternative? You're not going to fight for Ukraine. You're going to end up fighting for Russia. And people used to understand that, and now there are a lot of people that don't.
No, because propaganda is a tool that is incredibly effective, that's been used since the beginning of human conflict. And Russians have perfected it behind our backs in the darkness since World War II. I mean, Putin was there when the Berlin Wall fell, and he never got over it. He was pissed off about it. And he always wanted that border back again. He feels entitled to this part of Europe, and he realized that he could formulate a plan, which was realizing that the West is actually it likes to believe the best in people. People in Britain and America like to think, you know what, people can change, people can be good. And Putin noticed that, and he thought propaganda is what's going to work on them. And that's why he started building the networks that work even inside Ukraine to try and humanize Russians, when Russians shouldn't be humanized, actually. And that might sound controversial, but they've made that decision by not protesting this war, by illegally invading this country, by being indifferent to Ukrainian lives. I mean, Russians are happy with this war. They actually don't care. We see this with people that do streeters and interviews in that country, and they're indifferent as a people. And the culture of Russia is a culture of mafiaism, of cronyism, and of looting. And culture isn't random. Culture doesn't fall from the sky in the middle of the night or grow on trees. Culture actually comes from people, from Russian people. British culture comes from British people, and Ukrainian culture comes from Ukrainian people. And we should start looking at most Russians as the way that the Russian government is behaving, and start looking at the propaganda in the same way. But we're decades ahead of realizing that. It's something I didn't really know about until the last few months, until actually living here, until actually going to the front lines in this country, and when you can actually feel the Russians that are nearby. Because where they come, darkness follows, electricity dies, the state of the trenches, the state that they treat each other in is despicable compared to the Ukrainians. And you can see the cultural difference. You can see the difference between Russians and Ukrainians with your own eyes. And you can feel it when you're in Kherson. You can feel them at the other side of the river. You can feel them looking at you in the sky. And it only took that moment until getting there to realize just how toxic it was. And most Westerners will not have the experience that I had going to those places to realize those things. But what we could do is have our governments blockade this propaganda immediately and look at it as wartime propaganda. Back in World War II, we threw Lord Haw in prison. We threw propagandists that would pollute the British radio waves with Nazi content, paid for by the Nazis. We threw them in prison for treason. This is actually almost getting to a point where it's worse. And we're not throwing them in prison. We're giving them awards for their contributions to British society, which is filling it with filthy Russian money.
Well, we're also not.
Okay.
I'll just say something very quick. We're also not like arresting people, like the likes of Kim.com. And I mean, he's in Malaysia, right? But we have a lot of people like that, like Tucker Carlson. Why is he not arrested? He's very clearly a paid propaganda piece, right? And Jackson Hinkle. Like, we have so many people like that. And they're all not only are they just spitting out like insane bullshit, pardon my French, but they're also very clearly paid by Russia, and there's so much traces of them being paid by Russia. If you look at their bank accounts, I'm sure you would know that would not even take 10 minutes to find sources of Russian money, because it doesn't seem like they're being very careful. They're in your face about it.
But we won't do
Elon,
that because we have an obsession with the holy grail of journalism. You can't
you know,
attack journalists. You can't do anything.
yeah, yeah,
But actually,
freedom of
Jackson
speech.
is not a journalist.
Yeah,
None of those people are journalists. Tucker is not a journalist. You don't go to a supermarket in Moscow during the Russian invasion, make propaganda about how great it is, and claim to be journalists. So they're not journalists. They're activists, and they're taking money from a country that's at war with you. You can feel as entitled as you like to send the resources of your intelligence agency to look into the bank accounts and go after them. No one should complain about that because they're not journalists. They're not.
I can tell you, one of the things that really sort of put me into a deep spiral of depression the other day is Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson sitting there in a podcast laughing
Oof.
about how
Yeah.
they're literally taking Russian money and how they're screwed if that ever comes out, and they're not even hiding it. They're
No, but they don't
saying
have
it
to hide
out
it
in
because
the
we're doing
open.
nothing. Why should they hide it? We're not doing anything. They would hide it. They would hide it if we actually had a backbone. They would be scared. They wouldn't be saying that, but we don't. So they say it on television. They're laughing at the American
Yeah,
public
like,
and
can
pretending
we
to be patriots.
concentrate a little bit on the fact that that literally happened? There was a podcast between Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk where they were sitting in a white room on their chairs laughing about the fact that had they lived in an alternate universe, they'd be screwed because they're aiding Russia.
But this is, it's starting to resemble Russian television. When you watch Vladimir Slovenyov's programs, and they're literally looking like the bad guys from Star Wars, with their red set, and
He's got the
pontificating
outfit.
and imagining.
He's
Yeah,
got
but
the
he's got the
outfit.
outfit. But we're starting to match them in that literal evil. I mean, what the hell is going on?
That's crazy.
Oh.
Well, what I was going to say, a very dangerous narrative, which I see quite often in the comment sections of Western publications. NATO expansion led to this war. It is all because NATO was expanding beyond for Poland, Baltic states, and everything else. I didn't understand it for a long time, but have you watched Terminator 2, the movie? Yeah?
Yes.
The little guy, he asked Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, aren't we friends with Russians now? It was 1991. So the narrative, the glorifying, mystifying the Russian soul, it is glorious culture. It was so deep since 1991 that they are no longer enemies. They are friends. And now you see it. NATO was expanding, although Russia was not aggressive anymore, which is not true, of course. And here we see a lot of people of the older generation spreading the narrative that NATO expansion led to Russia fighting against Ukraine. And speaking about culture, there's the Russian filmmaker Karen Khashnazarov, I believe, who made a couple of old Soviet good movies, as they call in the old times of the Soviet Union. And he said that attacking Ukraine was a counter-strike to NATO because Ukraine strived to join NATO. It was the last straw of Russia. It was so aggressive against the Russians because people wanted to be safe from Russian aggression, and that is not okay. So
It's ridiculous. I mean, also NATO's point is to expand, right? It's to expand peace and to encompass all of Europe and all of the countries that want to be part of it. The idea, I mean, I'm shocked that that argument was weaponized and that the Russians managed to make that happen so much. Because NATO is literally the point of NATO was peace. I mean, now they're kind of pathetic, to be honest. They're not really doing anything they need to be doing, same as the UN. But the point of it was peace after World War II. And the idea that it has been weaponized into something that is the aggressor shows you everything you need to know about how successful Russian propaganda is. Because it's blaming a rape victim at this point. It's blaming, it's just, it's out of control. It's out of control. I mean, I think this should be studied in the history books of propaganda after this war, specifically how they managed to weaponize NATO like that. But it just shows how successful it is. They can make anyone believe anything. They can make anyone believe that the US elections are rigged, which they did. They could ignite a race war in Britain, which they did by being linked to accounts that said that the Southport stabber was Muslim. They did that in our country recently. They can make anyone believe anything. It's out of control.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I feel like every time I look at the news and every time I look at the narratives that people are especially spreading on social media, I'm just kind of like, do we live in the Matrix? I don't understand like how little awareness, like self-awareness and awareness about the world you need to be able to believe this, but nothing surprises me anymore. So I guess every time we do these panel discussions, I always ask at the end of it, what do you think needs to change for people to actually start understanding what's happening? Because what's really happening is we're living in World War III.
Well, I think human beings only realize threats when it's too late. Might be the same with climate change. Maybe we'll only realize that it was real until we're all literally about to have our cities flooded and be burned alive. Maybe we won't realize in the West the Russian threat until the blitz happens again in London. And the same view that I have out of the bedroom window in Odessa is the same window that people have in New York. I don't know, but things only change at the last second with humanity because that's how people are. They're always the last to leave the party. And they're always the last to act on anything. And I hope that they realize in this war just before the 11th hour, just before the last second. Otherwise, it's all over.
In your personal opinion, do you think we've reached the point of no return, or do we still have time and ability to fix things?
I think that this is difficult because Western imperialism and American imperialism is now seen as a dirty word because of the lies of the Iraq War and things like that. And so now a big part of the American public and British public don't want any of our countries involved in anything foreign or interference. But we should be, because some countries in the world need to actually be the superpowers. Someone has to be a superpower. You just have to decide who it is. Is it going to be China? And look at how they're colonizing Africa right now. Is it going to be Russia? And look at how they're treating with military force. Or is it going to be America, which had its problems, but exported liberalism? I think when we decide what that is, and when we get over that, then we'll realize our future. But we need to stop losing faith in ourselves as countries and realize that actually it's okay to export good ideas and to, I don't know, go back to the old days of liberalism.
You know, Kaylin, I'm gonna need you to make a reel or a TikTok or whatever vertical format that is where you say exactly that so I can reshare that, because I feel like the argument of America is an imperial power too. Well, you know, you can decide what you want to buy in America and you can decide how many thousands of dollars you want to spend on Dyson headphones every month. But in Russia, you can't do that, and neither can you do that in China, because there are human surveillance systems and a scale of you know of your behavior and your give back to society that you have to follow. So did your light
True.
just die?
They are throwing me out here. It's closed.
uh,
So I have to go.
well, that's very
They just
timely
waved and
because
closed the light.
that is very timely because we're steadily approaching the end of this conversation, and that was a fantastic thing to wrap it up with. Paul, do you have anything to say while Kaylin shows us the beauty of Kyiv in the background?
I would really wish our dear guest Killian to have a nice hot drink after he's been standing out in the balcony for an hour or so. It's autumn in Kyiv, and I really hope, I pray for that Kyiv remains the same as it is now, the free Kyiv, when we can speak whatever we want with whoever we want and visit, have a nice coffee or tea on the balcony watching our Mikhailivsky church, and Ukraine stays independent country. So that's my hope.
That sounds amazing. Okay, very cool. Well, I
Thank
now
you
have to
for
go.
yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'm sure I will see you soon, and I'm sure we'll have you back on this channel shortly. Thank
Have a
you,
nice evening,
Kaylin.
Thank you so
everyone.
much for having me. Right, I'm going in. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Good to see you. Bye.
Well, I'm sure that was educational and probably ruffled some feathers, because honestly, I find that a lot of people really don't like hearing the truth, and a lot of people really don't like hearing the criticism of the Western world and everything that's been going on in it. I hope that this conversation inspires you to think out of the box and think deeper about the things that are really happening in the world and how they affect all of us. And if you enjoyed this conversation and you would like to hear more conversations like it, please don't forget to subscribe to The Gaze and UATV English. Give this video a like, a hearty one, send it to a friend, and of course, leave a comment with your opinion, because I read all of them and I am very interested in what you have to say. See you next time.